Hey everyone, welcome to Legalbytes. I'm Alyte, and on this channel we explain the law one bite at a time. So in our last video, we did a part 1 of the Pennsylvania case that struck down the state's pandemic lockdown orders. This is part 2, coming on up on Legalbytes. Okay, so I'll get right into it. Last time, we first went through the basics of the case, and then we went through the issue of whether in pandemic civil liberty cases, courts should use a deferential standard like that in the 1905 case Jacobson, or whether they should use a normal constitutional review, aka the three-tiered scrutiny system. If you haven't already seen that video, you might want to check it out, so I'll link to it here somewhere. Otherwise, we'll now go over the merits of the case, and I'll give a conclusion. Let's get into it. So remember that last time I said that the court in this case rejected the deferential standard found in the 1905 Jacobson case. As a result, the court applied the normal constitutional three-tiered scrutiny approach. Applying normal scrutiny, the court held the following. 1. The gathering limits imposed by the executive orders violate the First Amendment. 2. The executive orders violated plaintiffs' right to substantive due process under the 14th Amendment. And 3. The business closure provisions of the executive orders violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. To reach the first conclusion, the court determined that the regulation in question was a content-neutral rule regulating gatherings of people. Even though the political plaintiffs group was alleging violations of their First Amendment rights as to political events like rallies and fundraisers for their political campaigns, the court found that the regulation on its own did not make a difference on the basis of the type of political messaging at the events. Because of that, it's a content-neutral regulation. If you remember from the first video, I said that usually content-neutral First Amendment cases trigger intermediate scrutiny. Remember also that in order for a regulation to be upheld under intermediate scrutiny, it has to be motivated by an important interest, and the regulation has to be substantially related to that interest. Another way of putting it is that the non-content-based restriction must be narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest and leave open ample alternative channels of communication. Here, the court determined that the executive orders regulating gatherings of people failed under intermediate scrutiny. Although the judge found that the restriction on gatherings served a significant government interest, namely managing the effects of the pandemic in Pennsylvania, he also found that the restrictions failed because they were not narrowly tailored to that interest. In support of that conclusion, the court pointed to a couple inconsistencies in the application of the regulation. First, there's the fact that the commercial gatherings like stores, malls, large restaurants, and other businesses were not subject to the 25 indoor and 250 outdoor cap like the rest of the gatherings were. And second, there was a discrepancy in the way it was enforced between, on the one hand, gatherings like political fundraisers and rallies, and on the other hand, other political protests which vastly exceeded the 250-person limit and which the government actually partook in. Also, the court said that the limitations were not narrowly tailored because they did not address the specific experience of the virus across Pennsylvania. Particularly, some counties that are sparsely populated and haven't had as many cases of the virus have the same kinds of restrictions as the urban areas that have had a high number of cases. Basically, the court said that in order for these regulations to really be narrowly tailored, they would need to align more closely with the numbers of cases county by county. Okay, so that's the First Amendment issue. Looking at the court's second holding, the court found that the Pennsylvania government's orders violated plaintiffs' rights to substantive due process under the 14th Amendment. So this part of the lawsuit has to do with two things. 1, the Pennsylvania government instituting stay-at-home provisions, and 2, closing down non-life-sustaining businesses. Before we get into those two in detail, let me first explain substantive due process. Due process refers to a series of rules and principles that ensure that each person is treated with the same exact process under the law so that his or her private rights are protected. Due process rights are the reason why, when dealing with the law, individuals are entitled to proper notice and a decision that's ultimately made by a neutral decision maker. Substantive due process is something that developed around the end of the 19th century. It's designed to protect an individual's rights where technically the proper procedure has been used, but it's been wielded in such a way that it creates unjust treatment. The idea of substantive due process means that under the 5th and 14th Amendments of the United States Constitution, legislation needs to be fair and reasonable in content, and likewise needs to further a legitimate government objective. As for the stay-at-home provisions, the court noted that the Third Circuit, which is binding authority for this court, normally applies intermediate scrutiny for cases that involve intrastate travel. In other words, loitering, wandering, or other similar activities around the neighborhood. In this case, however, the court distinguished the stay-at-home measures because of how all-encompassing saying they are, and decided that strict scrutiny was therefore more appropriate. That said, the court said that regardless of whether the court was using strict scrutiny or intermediate scrutiny, the lockdown measures should be struck down. That's because the stay-at-home orders, while serving a significant government interest, were not narrowly tailored to that interest for several reasons. First, the orders created a situation where the default was that people were restricted to their homes except for a few exception activities. Second, these kinds of broad, open-ended population lockdowns have never been used to combat any other disease before. And third, the CDC guidelines provided a quote-unquote full menu of options that the state could have used, which were far less restrictive than what they actually chose to do. Next, the court turned to the regulations closing down non-life-sustaining businesses, finding that these too violate the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. First, the court noted that the plaintiffs, particularly the business plaintiffs, were claiming that the substantive due process right of a citizen to pursue a chosen occupation were being violated by these orders. Although the court said that this right has been around for over a century, there actually isn't much case law on the issue. Because of that, the court had to pretty much figure out what level of scrutiny would apply in this kind of case. Because this is basically an economic legislation issue, the court reasoned that it should use rational basis review, so the lowest level of scrutiny, and the easiest for the government to meet. Remember that for a regulation to be upheld under rational basis review, it needs to be rationally related to a legitimate government interest. The court pointed to the fact that there was no central formalized definition of the term life-sustaining. According to the evidence that came out in this case, the way they determined whether a business was life-sustaining was as follows. They had a list of businesses. They called them life-sustaining businesses. If the business was on the list, it was life-sustaining, and you knew it was life-sustaining because it was on the list. The court found this method to be impermissibly arbitrary. Adding to that, the list of life-sustaining businesses apparently changed 10 times between March 19, 2020 and May 28, 2020. And what's more, the government started out with a process for businesses that were left off the list to submit information to show they should have been classified as life-sustaining and therefore permitted to operate. The state government closed down that waiver process on April 3rd. That means that after April 3rd, if a business thought it was wrongly left off the list, there was nothing they could do about it. Basically, all of that together meant that the business shutdowns were arbitrarily designed, implemented, and administered, and they deprived the business plaintiffs of an objective plan, the ability to determine how critical classifications were supposed to be made, and a mechanism for challenging an alleged misclassification that otherwise completely shut them down. But wait, there's more. The court went on to say that the regulations were also arbitrary because there were some businesses that were on the life-sustaining list which sold the same products as other businesses that were excluded from the same list. And the tendency there was that smaller family-owned stores were left off the list, whereas massive competitors like Lowe's, Home Depot, and Walmart stayed open because they had the benefit of being on the list. As a result, these smaller businesses had to be shut down completely, and many were left to go under. So all of that was part of the court's reasoning for the second holding. Moving on to the third holding, the court found that the business closure provisions of the executive orders also violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Here, the business plaintiffs claimed that they were treated differently than other similar businesses in other counties. Because the plaintiffs did not allege that they were in any sort of protected class, such as race, religion, or gender, the court used what's called a class of one theory to approach the matter. Under this theory, in order to win, a plaintiff has to prove that 1. The defendant treated him or her differently than others similarly situated. 2. The defendant did so intentionally. And 3. There was no rational basis for the difference in the treatment. Just like with the previous holding, if the distinctions made by the regulation are arbitrary or irrational, they do not hold up under this level of scrutiny. First, as to the plaintiff's argument that they should have been treated the same as similar businesses across county lines, the court found that Pennsylvania's method of rolling out a reopening plan county by county was rational because it followed along population density differences, infrastructure, and other factors. However, the same could not be said about the way in which Pennsylvania divided businesses into life-sustaining and non-life-sustaining. Because of the fact that they never defined what it meant to be a life-sustaining business, and because of the weird ways they applied the distinction, the court found that the shutdown of non-life-sustaining businesses did not rationally relate to the government's legitimate interest in public health safety. Whew. That was a lot to cover. To wrap it up, the court in this case decided not to go with the deferential standard in the Jacobson case we mentioned in the first video. Then the court decided that the limitation on numbers of people at gatherings violated plaintiffs' First Amendment right to assemble, the stay-at-home order violated the plaintiff's substantive due process rights in preventing intrastate travel, and the shutdown of non-life-sustaining businesses violated both plaintiffs' substantive due process rights and their equal protection rights. Although this court didn't follow Jacobson, others have decided to follow the case and give the state or local government greater deference than Judge Stickman did here. Given how much litigation there is out there regarding these lockdown measures right now, the issue of whether to follow a more deferential standard in an emergency or whether to continue applying the three-tiered scrutiny system is an important issue because it has a huge impact on the outcome of civil liberties litigation. Because of that, if there continues to be a wide disparity between various courts as these cases make their way on the merits through the appellate system, we may very well see some of these cases go up to the Supreme Court to give that kind of clarity for how courts should be analyzing these matters. So, what do you guys think? Should local and state governments be given more leeway like under Jacobson, or should we put them to the same constitutional standard as we do at times when the country is not in an emergency situation? Also, what do you think about the court's specific holdings in this case? Let us know in the comments below. If you've stuck around through both of these videos, I really appreciate that. I hope you found this informative and interesting as always, and if you did, we'd love it if you'd hit the like button. And if you're new to this channel and you want to see more, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is uploaded. Thanks!